The hall of the ninefold throne had been carved from a single tier of blue crystal, so vast that a whole moon had been quarried to shape it, and under its light, every voice sounded like a confession. 10,000 delegates stood beneath that dome on the throne world of Orlia Prime, and not one of them was human, except the boy holding the water ewer near the back of the delegation. His name was Kale Sundren, and he was 19 standard years old, and he was there because someone had to carry the water. That was the whole of humanity's station in the Ceridine Imperium. Humanity had come to the stars late, a client species lifted only 2 centuries before, given the meanest lanes and the coldest colonies, permitted to watch the great powers of the galaxy debate the fate of 100 worlds and never once to speak. Kale had grown up in the servants' warrens beneath the diplomatic quarter. He had learned 9 languages by scrubbing the floors where they were spoken. He had learned to be invisible, which in the Imperium was the same thing as being safe. So he saw what a delegate would not have troubled to see. He saw that the Chancellor was afraid. Chancellor Marinth of the Vale stood at the foot of the throne, tall as 3 men, his silver-gray skin catching the crystal light, his 4 eyes arranged in a diamond upon his long face. The Vale were the oldest of the ruling species, the founders of the conquered that had become the Imperium, and Marinth was the sharpest blade in their court. He did not raise his voice. He never needed to. But Kale, who had spent his life reading the small tremors of the powerful, saw the way the Chancellor's lower hands would not stay still, and he understood that whatever was about to happen had been decided already, in some smaller and darker room than this one. "The right of standing is concluded," Marinth said, and his voice threaded through the hall's acoustics until it reached every ear at once. "The assessors have rendered their verdict upon the species designated human. It is my sorrowful duty to read it into the eternal record." A stillness came over the human delegation. There were only 11 of them, led by old Ambassador Voss, a stooped man who had spent 40 years learning to bow at exactly the correct angle. He bowed now. He did not yet know what for. "The right finds the human species congenitally unstable," Marinth read from a tablet of light, "prone to violence beyond correction, incapable of the long patience the conquered requires. The assessors project that within a single Vale lifespan humanity will fracture, war upon itself, and become a plague vector across any lanes it is permitted to travel." He paused, and the pause was a performance, and Kale knew it was a performance. The conquered cannot carry what will not be carried. It cannot patch what is broken in the making. Therefore the ninefold throne, in its mercy, decrees severance. The word dropped into the hall like a stone into a well, and the silence that followed was the silence of 10,000 delegates deciding that this did not concern them. Ambassador Voss straightened. For the first time in Kale's memory the old man forgot to bow. "Severance," he repeated. "Chancellor, severance has not been invoked in 600 years. It was invoked against the Thren, and the Thren are extinct." "The Thren chose extinction," Marinth said gently. "As all severed peoples choose, the throne does not kill. The throne merely withdraws its hand." He turned his diamond of eyes upon the small human cluster, and something in the set of him was almost kind, which was the most frightening thing Kale had ever seen. "Humanity's jump registrations are revoked. Your lease upon the Sol system's outer holdings is annulled. Your vessels will be stripped of conquered jump cores, which are and always were the property of the conquered, loaned and now recalled. You will be permitted sublight passage to a single system, chosen for you, where you may live out your nature undisturbed by the peoples you would otherwise harm." "You are marooning us," Voss said. "We are sparing the galaxy," Marinth answered, "and sparing you the shame of what you would become. This is mercy, Ambassador. History will record it as mercy." Kale's hands had gone cold around the ewer. He was doing the arithmetic that no one on the dais would bother to do. Strip the jump cores from humanity's ships, and you did not merely inconvenience a species. Jump cores were not engines humans had built. They were least conquered technology, and no human alive knew how to make one, because the conquered had made very sure of that. Without them, the distances between stars became what they had been for 10,000 years of human history before the veil arrived. Impossible. Generations long. Humanity would be sealed inside one system like an insect in amber, and the amber would be a dying star, and in 100 years there would be no one left to remember that humanity had ever touched the sky at all. That was not marooning. That was a grave with the courtesy of a slow lid. He looked at Marant's restless lower hands and he thought, "You are lying. You are afraid and you are lying, and I do not know why." The verdict was ratified by acclamation, which meant that the 10,000 delegates were permitted to remain silent, and their silence was recorded as consent. Ambassador Voss was given 19 days to gather his people from every colony and holding they possessed and bring them to the muster point above the world men had named Threshold, a red dwarf's third planet, chosen, Marant said, for the mildness of its climate. Cale had seen the survey files once, cleaning an office. Threshold's mildness was the mildness of a corpse that had not yet gone cold, thin air. A biosphere of lichen and grief, the kind of world you gave to a people you expected to bury. The delegation filed out beneath the crystal dome. Cale carried the empty ewer because a servant who dropped his burden was a servant who drew the eye, and even now, especially now, he could not afford the eye. It was in the antechamber, in the long marble throat that led out of the hall, that the truth found him. He had fallen behind the delegation to write a toppled standard, and so he was alone when the two assessors passed. They were Vale, junior court functionaries in the gray of the augury office, and they were speaking the high liturgical dialect that servants were not supposed to understand, and Cale understood it perfectly because he had learned it from a dying tutor in the Warrens who had once been a priest. "Reads it aloud as though he believes it," the first was saying. "He believes what the throne needs him to believe," said the second. "That is what a chancellor is for." Still to Dr. Standing, if it were ever known. It will not be known. The true augury is sealed in the deep record, and the deep record does not open for 10,000 years. Cale had gone, very still behind the fallen standard. He kept his hands moving, writing the poll, because a servant who stopped moving was a servant who was listening. The first assessor lowered his voice, but the marble carried it. "I read the true augury before they sealed it. Do you know what it said?" "I do not want to know." "It said humanity would surpass us." A silence. "Not fracture, not plague, surpass. Within 3 Vale generations, given the lanes, humanity would outbuild the conquered, outreach it, and the client would become the throne." The augury did not say humanity was broken. It said humanity was rising and that we could not stop the rising once it began, only prevent its beginning. That is why the Chancellor invoked severance, not because we are strong and they are weak. Because we are old and they are young, and he could not bear to watch a young thing outgrow him. The second assessor said nothing for a long moment. Then, softly, "Speak of it again, and you will be sealed in the deep record beside it." They passed on. Their footsteps faded into the crystal hum of the hall, and Cale Sundren stood alone in the marble throat with an empty ewer in his hands and the largest secret in the galaxy sitting in his chest like a swallowed coal. He did not move for a long time. He was 19. He was no one. He was a boy who carried water, and he had just been handed the difference between his species living and dying, and there was no one in the universe he was permitted to tell. But there was one thing a servant learned that a delegate never did. A delegate believed the record was the truth. A servant knew the record was only what the powerful had decided to write down, and that everything else, the real everything, the everything that mattered, happened in the spaces the record ignored. In the antechambers, in the Warrens, in the mouths of 2 junior functionaries who thought no human could understand them. The truth was not a weapon Cale could use here. Here he was nothing. But the Imperium had just decided to send all of humanity to one place together for the first time in its history. And in that place, far from the crystal dome, the truth might mean something. He would carry it there. It was, after all, what he was for. He carried things. The 19 days were a wound that would not close. Cale worked passage on a stripped-down human freighter called the Meridian Dawn, one of 400 vessels that limped toward threshold on chemical thrust and prayer after conquered technicians had come aboard and cut the jump cores out of them like surgeons removing a heart. He watched them do it to the Dawn. The technicians were polite. They logged each core by serial number, sealed it in a stasis crate, and thanked the captain for the return of conquered property. When they were gone, the ship's drive was a hollow socket, and the stars, which had been an afternoon's travel apart, were suddenly 1,000 years. The exodus took most of a year, even at the muster point, which was already inside the target system. Humanity had spread across 40 colonies and holdings, and every one of them had to be emptied, because the conquered's writ was absolute. Any human found outside the threshold system after the severance date would be treated as a plague vector and rendered. No one doubted the word. Everyone had heard what had happened to the Thren. So they came. They came in ore haulers and passenger liners and jury-rigged colony arcs, in ships that had been built for a week's voyage and were now expected to be homes. They came with their libraries and their seed banks and their dead, because a people being buried takes its dead with it. 400 million human beings, the entire species, funneled into orbit around a dying red star, looking down at a world of lichen and thin, cold wind, and understanding all at once and together that the galaxy had looked at them and decided they were not worth keeping. Cale found that the despair had a sound. It was very quiet. It was the sound of a crowd that has stopped talking about tomorrow. He carried his coal of a secret through all of it, and he did not speak, because the moment had to be right, and because a truth spoken to a broken people is only another wait. He waited. He watched for the one who would know what to do with it. Her name was Ada Morrow, and she was the speaker of the muster. She had not been elected so much as revealed. When the arcs began to gather and no conquered authority remained to give orders, and the old colonial governors discovered that their commissions had been signed by a power that had just disowned them, it was Ada Morrow who had begun, quietly, to make the trains run. She was a logistics officer from the series Holding, 40 years old, plain-spoken, with the kind of tired competence that people follow because it does not lie to them. She did not promise anyone that things would be all right. She promised them that the water would be rationed fairly, and the sick would be seen, and the dead would be recorded by name. And it turned out that in the middle of the end of the world, that was enough to build an authority on. Cale got to her the way he got anywhere. He made himself useful and he made himself invisible, and he waited until the crowd around her thinned. It took him 3 weeks. When at last he stood before her improvised desk in the belly of the Ark Perseverance, she looked up at him with eyes that had not slept properly in a year and said, "You've been circling me for a while, young man. Series files say you were court staff. Sundrin, water carrier." She almost smiled. "Come to tell me the Chancellor's changed his mind." "No, Speaker," Cale said. "I've come to tell you why he did it." Something in his voice made her set down her stylus. She had heard every kind of grief and every kind of scheme in the past year, and she had developed an ear for the difference between a person who wanted something and a person who was carrying something. "Sit," she said. "Talk." So he told her. He told her about Marinth's restless lower hands. He told her about the marble throat and the 2 assessors and the high liturgical dialect a dying priest had taught him in the Warrens. He told her the words as exactly as he could, because he had repeated them to himself every night for a year so that he would not lose a syllable, not fracture, not plague, surpass. He watched her face as he spoke, and he saw the tiredness burn off it like fog off water, and underneath the tiredness there was something he had not seen on a single human face since the Hall of the Ninefold Throne. There was anger. And under the anger, colder and steadier, there was calculation. When he finished, Ada Morrow sat back and was quiet for a long time. Around them the ark creaked with the small sounds of 400,000 people trying to sleep in a graveyard. "You understand," she said finally, "that we can't prove a word of it. It's sealed in a record we can't reach, on a world we can't return to, told to me by a 19-year-old who used to carry the Chancellor's water. If I stood up tomorrow and told the muster that the Veil marooned us because we're better than them, they'd call it the sweetest lie they'd ever heard, and half of them would love me for it, and none of them would believe it." "I know," Kale said. "Then why bring it to me? What good is a truth I can't use?" Kale had thought about this on every long night of the Exodus, watching the socket where the Dawn's heart had been. "Because you weren't going to use it," he said. "You were going to prove it. The augury didn't say we'd surpass them because a Veil priest wished it. It said it because it read what we are. The Chancellor believed it enough to bury it. Enough to break the mercy laws and doctor a standing and maroon 400 million people rather than let it happen." He leaned forward, and the invisibility he had worn all his life fell off him like a cloak he was finally done with. Speaker, the most powerful being in the galaxy, looked at humanity and was so certain we would outbuild his conquered that he threw away his own laws to stop us. He gave us a death sentence because he was afraid of what we'd do if we lived. He set his hands flat on her desk. "So let's live," Kale said. "Let's do the thing he was afraid of, not to prove it to them, to prove it to us." Ada Morrow looked at the water carrier for a long, long moment. Outside the viewport, the red dwarf burned its slow, miserly light over a world that had been chosen for the graves it would make. Somewhere below, the first landing parties were sinking pylons into cold lichen and calling it, without much conviction, a colony. "How old are you, Sundrin?" she asked. 19. 19. She shook her head slowly, and now she did smile, and it was not a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who has just been handed a reason. The Chancellor sealed his fear in a vault for 10,000 years so no one would ever open it. She picked her stylus back up. "Let's make him wish he'd sealed it deeper." They did not begin with vengeance. They began with water. That was Ada Morrow's genius, and Kale came to understand it slowly, over the first hard years on Threshold. A people who begin with vengeance spend themselves on it and have nothing left when the vengeance fails, as vengeance nearly always does. A people who begin with survival build the muscles that vengeance, if it ever comes, will need. So the first thing the human muster did on the third planet of a dying red star was not swear an oath against the Veil. It was dig a well. Threshold fought them for it. The thin air meant every laborer worked in a rebreather until the lichen farms could be coaxed into thickening the atmosphere, and the lichen did not want to be coaxed. The red dwarf gave light the color of a healing bruise, too little of it and in the wrong wavelengths. So the first crops died, and the second crops died, and the third crops, grown under lamps salvaged from 100 gutted ships, lived just barely enough to teach the fourth crops how. The world had a slow poison in its soil, a heavy metal load the survey files had politely declined to mention, and for 2 years the leading cause of death in the human colony was not starvation or cold, but the quiet failure of kidneys. 400 million became 380 million. The graves the Chancellor had prophesied got dug, and Ada Morrow recorded every name, because she had promised she would. But something else got dug too, and Kale was there for the digging. Humanity had been given no jump cores. The conquered had been very thorough about that. It was, in the end, the whole mechanism of the sentence. A species without jump technology was a species sealed in one system forever, because the distances were not distances a body could cross. But the conquered had made an error, and the error was one that only a very old and very proud civilization could make. It had assumed that jump technology was the only door. It had assumed this because jump technology was the door the Veil had found 10,000 years ago, and the Veil had spent those 10,000 years so certain of their own path that they had stopped looking for others. They had not built a new principle of physics in 4,000 years. They had refined. They had elaborated. They had not asked the childish, dangerous question, "Is there another way?" Because asking it would have meant admitting the way they had was not the only one. Humanity asked the childish question because humanity had nothing else to do. They had in the arcs a thing the conquered had never bothered to confiscate because it did not think of it as a weapon. They had every human physicist, engineer, and mathematician alive, packed into one system, with nothing to lose and a very great deal to prove. The conquered had, in its mercy, performed the single most dangerous act one civilization can perform against another. It had taken 400 million clever, desperate people, and given them a common enemy and infinite time to think. Kale carried water to the labs at first. Then he carried equations between them, because the labs were scattered across a dozen half-buried domes, and the comnet was rationed and someone had to physically move the data slates. And a boy who could keep 9 languages straight in his head could also keep straight which slate went to which team and remember, on the way, what he had read on it. He was not a physicist, but he had the servant's gift, the gift he had honed in the marble corridors of Aurelia Prime. He saw the spaces between things. He noticed, one long red evening, that the gravitics team in Dome 4 and the exotic matter team in Dome 9 were both stuck on the same problem and did not know the other existed. And he said so, to the right person, at the right moment, and the two teams met. And 11 months later the thing that came out of that meeting changed the shape of the galaxy. They called it the threshold drive, after the world that had been meant to kill them, and it did not work at all the way a jump core worked. A jump core tore a hole in space and threw a ship through it, which was fast and elegant and required a technology no human could build. The threshold drive did not tear anything. It folded. It gathered the ship into a standing wave and slid it along the grain of spacetime itself, and it was slower than a jump. A voyage that a conquered ship crossed in a day might take a threshold ship a month, but it needed no least conquered heart, no serial numbered core that could be cut out and recalled. It was humanity's own. Every part of it could be built from the guts of a dying red star's asteroid belt by people who had learned to build everything from nothing because they had been given nothing. It was slower. Everyone understood that it was slower. The conquered, if it had ever learned of it, would have laughed at how slow it was. But it was theirs, and it could not be taken back, and it went to the stars. There was one more thing about the threshold drive, and Kale was the first to understand what it would mean, because Kale was the one who volunteered to ride it. The drive folded a ship along the grain of spacetime, and the folding did something to time. A voyage that lasted a month for the universe outside lasted only days for the crew inside the standing wave. It was not magic. The physicists had a great deal to say about frames of reference and proper time and the geometry of the fold, and Kale understood perhaps a third of it. But he understood the part that mattered. A courier who spent his life aboard threshold ships, folding between the growing scatter of human worlds, would age slowly. The galaxy would run ahead of him. Years would pass outside for every year that touched him. Humanity was going to spread now, slowly, world by hard-won world, along the grain instead of through the hole, and a spreading people scattered across light years with no jump net to bind them, needed something the conquered had never needed, because the conquered's jump planes made the galaxy small. Humanity's galaxy was going to be large again, large the way it had been before the veil, and a large galaxy needs couriers. It needs people who carry the truth from world to world, who stitch the far settlements to the near ones with their own bodies, who hold the whole scattered thing together by moving through it faster than anyone else can. It needs someone whose job is to carry things. Ada Morrow, who was speaker now of something that was slowly stopping being a muster and starting to be a nation, found Kale in the launch bay the night before the first long voyage, checking the seals on a courier ship they had named, without irony, the water carrier. "You know what this does to you," she said. She was grayer now. The first hard years had put 10 years on her in 5. The physicists explained it. "You ride the long fold, you come back and I'll be old and you'll be barely older. You'll bury all of us, Kale, one voyage at a time and never grow old enough to join us. You'll be 19 forever while the rest of us turn to your history." She studied him in the red light. "That's a lonely thing to do to a young man. I won't order it." "You're not ordering it," Kale said. He finished the seal. "Speaker, when I stood in that antechamber, I was the only human being who understood what had really happened to us, and I was 19, and there was nothing I could do with it but carry it. I've spent 5 years watching everyone around me build the thing the Chancellor was afraid of. I want to be the one who carries what we build, from world to world. I want to be the thread." He looked up at her, and she saw that the water carrier had made this decision a long time ago, somewhere in the marble corridors, and had only been waiting for the ship. "He tried to make our galaxy small enough to bury us in. Let me be the one who keeps it stitched together, while we make it too big for him to hold." Ada Morrow looked at the ship called the water carrier, and at the young man who would be its whole crew, and she understood that she was looking at something she would not live to see the end of. It was the particular grief of the founder, to plant a tree whose shade you will never sit in. She had felt it before. She would feel it again. "There's a thing I've been drafting," she said. "For the day we're a real thing and not just survivors with a good drive. I want you to carry the first copy, to every world we've got and every world we get." She pressed a slate into his hands. "Read it to me. Tell me if it's true." Kale read it. It was not long. Ada Morrow was a logistics officer, not a poet, and she wrote the way she ran a muster, plainly and without a wasted word. It was called the Covenant of Consent, and its heart was 3 plain sentences. "No world joins the human reach except by its own free asking, and any world may leave the same way. The strong among us exist to shelter the weak, and a strength that does not shelter has no place among us. We were cast out on a lie, and so we will build on the truth, whatever it costs us forever, because a people who lie about why they cast others out becomes the thing that cast us out." Kale read it twice. The second time he read it aloud, in the red light of the launch bay, and his voice did not quite hold steady on the last sentence. "It's true," he said. "It'll be hard," Ada Morrow said. "The first time it's convenient to break it, it'll be so easy to break it. The first world that begs to join us that we don't want. The first enemy it'd be simpler to lie about. That's when it'll matter that you carried it to every human being alive before we were big enough for it to cost us anything. So they can't say they didn't agree to it when it was cheap." She almost smiled. "The Chancellor sealed his lie in a vault so no one could check it. I want our truth carried out in the open, in a courier ship, read aloud on every world so that everyone can check it forever. Opposite of him. In every way we can manage, Kale, I want us to be the opposite of him." "That's the whole plan?" Kale asked. "Be the opposite of the thing that hurt us." "That's the whole plan," she agreed. "It's harder than vengeance and it lasts longer. Vengeance ends when the enemy's dead. This doesn't end at all." She stepped back from the ship. "Go be the thread, water carrier. Come back and tell me what we've become." The water carrier lifted on the standing wave the next morning, folded itself along the grain of a spacetime. The veil had stopped looking at 4,000 years ago, and slid out of the dying red star's light toward the second human world, which was 11 light years and, for Kale, 9 days away. When he arrived, 4 years had passed on threshold. He read the covenant aloud in the new colony's first pressure dome, to a crowd of settlers who had been children when the Exodus began and were raising children of their own now under a yellower, kinder sun. They listened to the 3 plain sentences. An old woman near the front, old to Kale, though she had been his age when he last stood on a human world, wept when he reached the last one. Afterward she gripped his young hands in her old ones and said, "You haven't aged a day. I remember you in the launch bay. I was going to marry a boy who worked the seals with you." She searched his unchanged face. "He died last winter, and here you are." "Here I am," Kale said. It was the first time he felt the cost of the thing he had chosen, and it would not be the last. He went back to the ship. There were 9 more worlds to reach, and the covenant to carry, and a lie in a distant vault that a growing people were, world by slow world, in a language the Chancellor did not yet know they were speaking, beginning at last to answer. The galaxy grew large again, and Kale Sundren moved through it like a needle through cloth, and behind him the human reach spread its slow, inexorable thread. He measured his life in voyages now, not years. Each fold was days for him and seasons for everyone else, and so his memory of the human reach was not a smooth film, but a series of still images, each one further along than the last, the way a man who looks away from a growing child and looks back sees not the growth but its result. He folded out to a frontier of 11 worlds and folded back to find 19. He folded out to 19 and returned to a reach of 40, bound not by jump planes, but by the slow, strong web of threshold ships and the couriers who rode them and the covenant they carried, read aloud in every new dome the way a keel is laid before a hull. Ada Morrow died in the 3rd decade. Kale was 2 worlds away when it happened, folding, and by the time the news caught him she had been in the ground of threshold for a year, buried in the cold, poisoned soil that no longer poisoned anyone, because the lichen farms had done in 40 years what the conquered swore no human world could do. He came back for the memorial that they held on the anniversary, because that was the soonest the fold would let him, and he stood at the grave of the woman who had recruited a water carrier, and he was 31 years old and looked 22, and every other founder in the ground around her had died old. They had made her the first speaker of the human reach, and they were choosing the second by the method she had invented, which was not really an election and not really an inheritance but a strange consensual thing the covenant had grown, in which worlds sent voices and the voices argued until they could no longer stand to disagree. Kale did not stay for it. He was not a governor. He had discovered, across the voyages, exactly what he was. He was the Reach's memory. He was the one human being who had seen every world when it was new and seen it again when it was old, the only living thing that had touched the whole scattered nation with its own hands. And so when the far worlds began, inevitably, to drift, to develop their own dialects, their own grudges, their own local convenient readings of the covenant that shaved a corner off it here and there, it was the courier who came folding out of the dark with the original 3 sentences and read them aloud unchanged, in the old woman's plain words, and reminded a whole planet what it had agreed to when the agreeing was cheap. That mattered more than anyone had guessed it would. The covenant's hardest test was never the veil. It was the human reach itself in the ordinary years, discovering over and over that principle is expensive, and that there is always a reason, this one time in this one case, to be a little less than you promised. Kale watched the reach nearly fail its own covenant a dozen times. He watched a wealthy inner world try to bind a poor outer one with debt until it could not leave, which the covenant forbade, and he watched the argument that followed nearly break the reach in 2, and he watched it hold barely, because enough people remembered, because a courier had made sure they remembered, that they had promised any world could leave the same way it joined. The inner world backed down. The debt was forgiven. It cost them, exactly as Ada Morrow had said it would, and they paid it, and the paying was the thing that made them a nation instead of merely an empire. Because they were becoming an empire. Kale saw that too, and it unsettled him, and he came to understand that it did not have to mean what the word had meant on Orlia Prime. The uplift began by accident and became the Reach's soul. There were, scattered across the galaxy the conquered had ruled, the leavings of the conquered's mercy, peoples the Imperium had found and judged and for one reason or another declined to carry. Not severed, most of them severance was reserved for peoples the conquered actively feared, but simply passed over. Species too slow, too strange, too poor to be worth a jump plane, left on their single worlds to rise or not rise on their own, watched sometimes, helped never, because the conquered's help was a lease and a leash, and it did not waste them on the unpromising. Humanity, folding out along the grain, found these worlds one by one. And humanity, which had itself been judged unpromising and left to die, looked at them and saw not clients to be leased but the reflection of its own abandonment. The first was a world of the S11 Ka, a patient, amphibious people who had built cities and philosophy, and had never been given the smallest reason to believe there was anyone above their sky who cared whether they lived. A conquered survey had noted them 4,000 years ago and moved on. A human colony ship, blown off its fold by a bad calculation, made landfall in S11 Ka waters expecting nothing, and found a civilization that had been waiting, without knowing it was waiting, for someone to arrive who did not want to own them. Humanity did not lease the SLL Ka a jump core. Humanity taught them to build a threshold drive. This was the thing the conquered had never once done in 10,000 years, given a client the actual key, the whole key, the principle, and not just the leased and recallable machine. Kale carried the decision to the Reach the way he carried everything, and there was a great argument because there is always a great argument, and the argument was settled by the second sentence of the covenant read aloud. The strong exist to shelter the weak, and a strength that does not shelter has no place among us. If the Reach kept the key to itself, it would become a smaller, kinder conquered, a leash held in a gentler hand. And a gentler leash was still a leash. They gave the SLL Ka the key. The SLL Ka asked to join the Reach. By their own free asking, in the words of the covenant, which was read aloud in the SLL Ka's own tongue by a courier who had spent a voyage learning it, because that was what the courier was for. And then there were the Threnu, and the Windriders of Call, and the deep city people of a world with no name in any conquered register, because the conquered had never thought it worth a name. World by world, key by key, the human Reach did the one thing an empire is never supposed to do. It made its clients into its equals, on purpose, as fast as it could, because it had written into its founding law that any other course would make it into the thing that had tried to bury it. And the Reach did not weaken. That was the fact that the conquered, had it been watching, would not have been able to comprehend. Every world humanity lifted and set free chose freely to stay, and brought its own strength to the whole, and the whole grew not by conquest but by the strange compounding arithmetic of a people who kept their word. An empire built on leashes must spend half its strength holding the leashes. An empire built on consent spends none, because no one is pulling to get free. The human Reach grew faster than the conquered had ever grown, and it grew load-bearing, every joint of it welded by a promise kept, and it did not have a single garrison world in all its spreading light because it did not need one. It was in the 5th decade that the conquered finally noticed, and sent a ship to remind humanity of its place. The ship was a veil cutter of the Border Watch, and it found a human world, one of the far ones, a mixed colony of humans and SLL Ka and 3 other uplifted peoples, and it did what a conquered ship did. It transmitted the writ of severance. It reminded the world that humanity was a plague vector, forbidden the lanes, sentenced, dead in law if not yet in fact, and it ordered the world to disperse and its non-human peoples to abandon the contamination of human contact. Kale was there. It was the only time in his long, strange life that the fold set him down exactly where history needed him, and he never decided whether it was luck or the grain of spacetime having a sense of theater. He stood in the colony's council dome and watched the veil writ scroll across the display in the high crystal glyphs of Aurelia Prime, and he was the only person in the room old enough, in memory if not in face, to have seen those glyphs before, under the ninefold throne, on the day his species was thrown away. The colony did not have a fleet. It had defense installations, because even a principled empire is not a foolish one, and the installations were enough to have destroyed the single cutter without effort, and every young officer in the dome was arguing to do exactly that. Blow the veil ship out of the sky. Answer the writ that had murdered 400 million with the murder of one crew. It would have felt like justice. It would have felt, after 50 years, like the first clean breath. Kale asked to speak. They did not know him. Couriers were legend more than acquaintance on the far worlds now, and this one looked 22 and claimed to have stood beneath the ninefold throne. But an old SLLK counselor who had learned the Reach's history recognized the ship in the docking log, the water carrier, the courier ship, the one from the founding stories, and made them listen. "If you fire," Kale said, "you will be right, and it will feel like justice, and you will have answered the conquered in the conquered's own language. You will have proven the augury they buried, not that we would surpass them, that we would become them." He looked around the dome, at the human faces and the SLLK faces, and the three other kinds of face that were in the Reach because the Reach had kept a promise. "They cast us out on a lie that we were violent beyond correction. For 50 years, we have been proving that lie a lie with every world we've freed instead of owned. Don't hand it back to them now for the pleasure of one clean breath." He turned to the display, to the scrolling glyphs of his childhood. "Send them home. Let them carry back the truth of what they found. Not a plague, not a graveyard, a nation of free peoples that could have killed them and chose not to because it remembered being killed. That will frighten the Chancellor more than any fleet, a fleet he understands. A promise kept is the one weapon the conquered has never held and cannot answer." They did not fire. They repaired the cutter's fold-damaged drive, because the Veil ship could not make its own way home, and a strength that does not shelter has no place among us applied. The counselor ruled, even to the strength of a defended world faced with a broken enemy. They fed the crew. They read the covenant aloud to them, in the high liturgical dialect, which a courier happened to know, and they sent the Veil watchship home to Orlia Prime with its writ unanswered, and its logs full of a thing the conquered had no category for. The cutter's captain, a young Veil who had expected to disperse a nest of plague carriers, stood at the airlock before departure and looked at Kale with all four eyes and said, in the liturgical dialect, "You understood me. In the dome, when I spoke to my crew, you understood every word." "I've understood you a long time," Kale said. "Longer than you'd believe." "What are you?" Kale thought about the marble throat and the empty ewer and the two assessors who had thought no human could understand them. "I'm the one who carries water," he said. "Go home, Captain. Tell them what you saw. Tell them exactly. It matters more than you know that they hear it true." The cutter folded home. And on Orlia Prime, for the first time in 50 years, the ninefold throne began, very slowly, to understand that it had made a mistake it could not unmake, and that the young thing it had tried to strangle in the cradle had grown up out of sight, along a grain of spacetime the Veil had stopped looking at, into something the conquered did not have the words to be afraid of yet. It would learn the words. Kale folded out toward home with the certainty settling in him like ballast. The conquered would learn the words soon, because the thing the augury had truly warned of was no longer coming. It had arrived. The hardest years of the human Reach were not the first ones, on the poisoned world under the miserly red star. Kale understood this only in looking back, across the long folds, the way a man understands the shape of a mountain only after he has come down the far side of it. The hardest years were the middle ones, the years of plenty, when the Reach had grown strong enough that keeping its promises finally cost something worth keeping. A poor and desperate people can afford to be principled, because principle is all it has. It is the rich and safe who discover how expensive a promise is and whether they meant it. The Reach discovered it in the matter of the Koravan. The Koravan were not an uplifted people, and not a client of the old conquered. They were a rival, a small, hard, warlike civilization on the far rimward edge of the human Reach, who had clawed their own way to the stars without a Veil lease or a human key, and who regarded the Reach's slow, gentle expansion the way a wolf regards a growing flock. They raided. They took threshold ships on the long folds where the ships were slowest and most defenseless, killed the crews, stripped the drives, and sold the principle of the fold to the highest bidder along the rim. They killed several thousand of the Reach's people over 2 decades, most of them couriers, most of them the young and the brave who rode the long, dangerous lanes precisely because someone had to hold the scattered reach together. Kale lost friends to the Koravan. He was old enough now, in true years if not in face, to have friends who could be lost, other couriers, the strange fraternity of the unaging who folded past one another in the dark and measured their lives the same slow way he did. He lost 3 of them to the Koravan in a single decade, and he carried the grief of it the way he carried everything, from world to world, and he watched the Reach's rage build behind him like water behind a dam. The Reach could have destroyed the Koravan. That was the thing that made the years hard. By then the Reach was vast and the Koravan were small, and every calculation of force came out the same way. The Reach could end the Koravan civilization in a season, sterilize their worlds, avenge its murdered couriers and secure its lanes forever, and it would have been, by any law the old conquered recognized, entirely just. The young officers argued for it, as young officers always argue. The families of the murdered argued for it, and who could tell them they were wrong? And the Reach came, in its middle years of plenty and strength, to the very edge of doing it, came so close that Kale, folding home with the grief of 3 friends aboard, was not sure which way it would fall. It was the 4th speaker who held the line, and she held it with the second sentence of a dead woman's covenant. "The strong exist to shelter the weak," she said, before the full council of the Reach, with the fleet already gathered and the target coordinates already loaded, "and a strength that does not shelter has no place among us. We wrote that when we were the weak. We wrote it about ourselves, about the peoples the conquered passed over, and we told ourselves it was a promise about kindness. But it was never only about kindness. It was about what we do with strength when we finally have it, and whether the getting of it changes what we are. The Koravan have murdered our people. Every law the conquered ever wrote would let us answer murder with extinction. But we did not build this Reach to be permitted the conquered's answers. We built it to have better ones. They did not destroy the Koravan. They did something slower and far harder, and Kale spent 2 decades of folds in the middle of it, because it was work that could only be done by couriers. The patient, dangerous, thankless work of carrying, again and again, into the teeth of a people who kept killing the carriers. The Reach did not sterilize the Koravan worlds. It defended its lanes, hardened its ships, protected its couriers with a competence that made the raids costlier every year. And into that hardness it folded, over and over, the same impossible offer it had made the SLLK and the Threnu and every people it had ever lifted. The whole key, freely given and a place as equals, by the Koravan's own free asking, whenever they chose to reach for it. For a long time the Koravan answered the offer by killing whoever carried it. And the Reach kept sending it, because the 4th speaker understood the thing Ada Morrow had understood in a launch bay long ago, that a truth forced on people is a truth they come to resent, and the only offers that hold are the ones people reach for themselves. And that means the offer has to keep being there, unbroken, through every reason to withdraw it, until the day they are finally ready to reach. The Koravan reached in the 6th decade. A younger generation of them, who had grown up watching the Reach defend without conquering, protect without avenging, hold out the same open hand through 20 years of that hand being bitten, finally asked the question the conquered's clients would later ask across a wider border. Why does the Reach not simply crush us, when it so plainly could? And the only answer that made sense of it was the one the Reach had been folding into their space for 2 decades. Because it does not want to own us, because it wants us to choose it, because the whole of what it is stands on that difference. The Koravan asked to join, by their own free asking, and the Reach lifted the people who had murdered its couriers into equal membership, and gave them the whole key, and Kale Sundrin carried the covenant to the Koravan homeworld in the plain words of a woman 100 years dead and read it aloud to the descendants of the ones who had killed his friends. He did not forgive them. Forgiveness was not his to give. It belonged to the dead. But he carried the offer because carrying was what he was for, and because he had come to understand across the long folds that this was the whole of the Reach's power and the whole of its difference. Not that it could not be cruel. That it chose, again and again at real cost, not to be, and that the choosing, repeated until the galaxy could not help but see it, was a force that no fleet could answer and no conquered could match. He was 70 years old the day he read the Covenant on the Korrivan world, and he looked 23, and an old Korrivan war chief who had raided the lanes in his youth listened to the 3 plain sentences and said, in the growling tongue Kale had spent a fold learning, "We could not have done what you did, held the hand out while we bid it. We would have burned us in your place." "I know," Kale said, "so would the empire that made us. That's why we didn't." He carried that home, too, the way he carried everything, and it settled into the great slow accumulation of the Reach's proof, world by world, promise by expensive promise, the compounding evidence of a power that had every reason to become the thing that hurt it and chose, each time at cost, to become its opposite instead. The conquered across the border did not see it yet. The conquered was still certain, in its crystal dome, that a people cast out on a lie would either wither or grow teeth, because those were the only 2 things the conquered could imagine a people doing, because they were the only 2 things the conquered had ever done. But the proof was accumulating. And the day was coming, though it was still years of folds away, when the whole galaxy would set the Reach's proof beside the conquered's sealed record and be forced, at last, to choose which one it believed. Kale folded on through the middle years, carrying water in the only way he knew, and did not yet know that the choosing had already, quietly begun. Empires do not fall the way they teach it in the schools. They do not topple in a day beneath a single blow. They rot slowly at the joints, and then one ordinary morning, the rot reaches something load-bearing, and the whole edifice comes down in an afternoon that historians will spend centuries pretending they saw coming. The Saradine Imperium had been rotting since the day it broke its own mercy laws to bury a fear, and Kale Sundren, folding through the 7th decade of his long, unaging errand, watched it come apart from the outside like a man watching weather. The rot had a name the conquered did not like to say, and the name was the silence in the deep record. An empire is a story a great many peoples agree to believe. The conquered story was that the 9-fold throne was just, that its judgments were true, that the right of standing measured a species without fear or favor, and that severance, when it came only to the broken and the dangerous. For 10,000 years the client peoples had believed it, because it was easier to believe than to check, and because the conquered had made checking impossible, and because as long as the client peoples believed it, it was, in the only sense that mattered to an empire, true. But the human reach was in the galaxy now, and the human reach was a machine for making truth checkable. It did not set out to be. It set out to keep a promise. We were cast out on a lie, and so we will build on the truth whatever it costs us, and it kept the promise the way it kept all of them, plainly in the open, in the reach of anyone who cared to look. Every world the reach freed, it freed with the whole key. Every judgment the reach made, it made in the open and let anyone check. Every courier who folded between the worlds carried not the reach's boasts but its accounts, its failures written down beside its successes, its broken promises recorded and paid for where all could see the paying. The reach was not perfect. It was something rarer and more dangerous to a rival empire than perfect. It was legible. Anyone, anywhere, could look at the human reach and see exactly what it was, because it had built its whole self on the principle that a power which hides why it does things becomes the thing that severed us. And the client peoples of the conquered, watching the human reach across the widening border, began to do the one thing the conquered could not survive. They began to compare. They saw a nation that gave its clients the key instead of the leash. They saw uplifted peoples made equal on purpose instead of held as tenants forever. They saw a border with no garrisons because none were needed, and worlds that could leave and did not, and a founding law that anyone could read in an afternoon and hold the powerful to. And then they looked at their own conquered, at the least jump cores that could be cut out of their ships at the throne's whim, at the sealed records and the unappealable rights, and the 10,000 years of judgments they had never once been permitted to check. And a question began to move through the client worlds of the Imperium like a crack through crystal. If the Conquered's judgments were true, why were they sealed? It was the human reach's mere existence that asked it. No human said it. Kale, folding from world to world, was scrupulous never to say it, because Adamaro had taught him 70 years dead that a truth you force on people is a truth they'll come to resent, and the only truths that hold are the ones people reach for themselves. The Reach did not preach at the Conquered. It simply lived in the open, an answer to a question. The Conquered had spent 10,000 years making sure no one asked. And the Conquered's own clients, seeing that the question could be asked and survived, began at last to ask it. The first world seceded from the Imperium in the 72nd year. It was a minor world, a client of no great importance, and it did not join the human Reach. It simply left the Conquered, cutting its own jump lane registrations, choosing the isolation of a threshold drive future over the leash of a Conquered present. The throne might have crushed it. In the old days, the throne would have crushed it in a week and sealed the record. But the human Reach was watching in the open, and the whole galaxy was watching the human Reach watch, and the Conquered understood, too late, that it had lost the one thing an empire cannot lose and continue. It had lost the ability to act in secret. Every judgment it made now would be checked, because a people existed who checked things, and who could not be prevented from existing, because they had their own key to the stars and no lease to recall. So the throne did not crush the seceding world, and because it did not, a second world seceded, and a third, and the fourth world did not merely secede, it asked, by its own free asking, in the words of a covenant its people had read across the border and could not stop reading, to join the human Reach. Kale carried that asking to threshold himself. He was 71 years old and looked 24, and he stood before the Speaker's Council. The fourth speaker now, a woman younger than Kale's true age and older than his face, who had grown up on the founding stories and treated the courier who walked out of them with the wary reverence you give a relic that has opinions. And he read the fourth world's petition aloud, and the council wept, because it was the first world to cross the border. The first client of the Conquered to look at the Reach and the Imperium side by side and choose, freely, the truth over the leash. It was not the last. Once the first crossed, the border became a tide. And it was in the 8th decade that the Conquered's rot reached the thing that had been load-bearing all along, and the truth Kale had carried out of the marble throat 80 years before finally came home. The deep record was breached. Not by humans. The Reach never touched it. The Reach had built its whole self on not being the kind of power that breaks into sealed vaults. It was breached by the Veil themselves, by a faction of the younger court, the augury office, the gray functionaries whose predecessors had once whispered in a marble corridor, while a human boy pretended not to listen. They had watched their empire come apart for 80 years, and they had come, slowly, terribly, to suspect why. And one of them at last did the thing no Veil had done in 600 years. She opened the true augury on humanity, the one sealed to lie hidden for 10,000 years, and she read what an old chancellor had buried. Not fracture, not plague, surpass. She read that humanity had been severed not because it was broken but because it was rising, and that the right of standing had been doctored, the mercy laws shattered, 400 million people marooned to die, not to protect the galaxy from humanity, but to protect the Conquered's pride from a young thing it could not bear to watch outgrow it. She read that the throne had known, that it had always known, that the whole 10,000-year story of the Conquered's justice had, at its very heart, a chosen and deliberate lie, and that the lie had been chosen by the fathers of the very court that now watched its empire dissolve into the reach of the people it had wronged. And then she did the thing the Conquered could not survive. She published it. She could do this because the human reach had, without ever intending to, changed what was possible in the galaxy. 80 years before, a sealed truth stayed sealed, because there was nowhere to send it and no one who could act on it. Now there was a whole civilization built on legibility, a galaxy full of client worlds that had learned to check things, a border across which truth flowed as freely as couriers could carry it. The young Veil augur transmitted the true augury into the open, to every world that would receive it, and the human reach, scrupulous to the last, did not trumpet it, did not gloat, did not weaponize it. It simply did what it did with all truth. It let it be checked. It carried it, unaltered, in the plain accounts of couriers, and set it beside the Conquered's official record, and let every people in the galaxy see the two side by side and decide for themselves which was true. They decided. The Imperium did not fall in an afternoon after all. It fell in a season, which for an empire of 10,000 years is the same as an afternoon. World after world, reading the true augury beside the sealed one, understood at last what they had belonged to. Not a justice. A fear wearing justice like a robe. The client peoples did not rise in war. The Reach had taught them, by example, that war was the Conquered's language and not theirs. They simply left. They cut their lease cores and asked, by their own free asking, to join a Reach that had spent 80 years proving it would not lease them anything. And the Conquered's garrison worlds found they had no one left to garrison. And the ninefold throne looked out from beneath its dome of blue crystal one ordinary morning, and discovered that it ruled almost nothing at all. Chancellor Marinth was still alive. The Veil were long-lived, and 80 years was less than half a Veil span, and so the same silver-gray hand that had read the writ of severance into the eternal record was the hand that now signed, one by one, the acknowledgments of worlds departing. He was old even for a Veil now, and Kale, receiving the reports on a fold home, tried to imagine the Chancellor's face and found he could remember only the restless lower hands, and the fear beneath the kindness, and the pause that had been a performance. Then the last report came, and it was not a report of another world departing. It was a petition, in the high crystal glyphs of Aurelia Prime, and it did not come from a client world. It came from the ninefold throne itself. The Conquered, what was left of it, the throne world and a handful of core systems, ringed now by the Reach it had birthed in its own cruelty and could no longer stand against, was asking, not demanding, not decreeing. For the first time in 10,000 years, the Ceridine Imperium was asking something of another power, and the thing it was asking was to be heard. The Reach's council convened to choose an envoy to carry humanity's answer to the throne world of the empire that had cast it out. There was, in the end, no argument at all, which after 80 years of arguments was its own kind of miracle. There was only one living human being who had stood beneath the ninefold throne on the day of the severance. Only one who had carried the truth out of the marble throat and into a dying red star's light, and every year since. Only one whom the whole Reach, human and SLLK and Threnu and all the freed peoples of the border, could agree should be the face humanity turned, at last, back toward Aurelia Prime. Kale Sundren was 81 years old and looked 25, and he prepared the water carrier for the longest fold of his life, home, to the crystal dome, to the empty ewer he had set down 8 decades before. He did not feel triumphant. He tried to and could not. He felt, instead, the strange vertigo of the very old and very young at once, the courier who had buried a nation one voyage at a time and never grown old enough to lie down beside it, folding now toward the single room where all of it had begun. He carried 3 things aboard the water carrier for the journey: the true augury, published and checkable, the fear the Conquered had buried; the covenant of consent, in Ada Morrow's plain 70 years dead words, and an empty ewer he had kept all this time, though he had never once told anyone why. He was going home to answer a chancellor. And he already knew that the answer would not be the one Marinth feared, because the whole point of 80 years had been to become the opposite of the thing that hurt them, and the opposite of a conqueror is not a gentler conqueror. It is something the conquered had no word for, and was about to learn. The water carrier folded out of the grain of spacetime into the light of Orlia Prime, and Kale Sundren looked upon the throne world of his childhood for the first time in 81 years. It had not changed, and that was the most terrible thing about it. The great blue crystal dome still caught the sun and threw it down in shafts the color of a promise. The orbital ring still turned, gilded, magnificent, 10,000 years of accumulated glory that had been built. Kale now understood, on the mechanism of the leash, every gleaming spar of it raised by a people held in place by a technology they were never given and could not refuse. The world was as beautiful as it had ever been. It was simply that Kale could see now what the beauty had cost and who had paid, and the seeing had taken him 80 years. There were no fleets to meet him. That was its own kind of answer. The conquered that had once commanded the lanes of 100,000 worlds could no longer put a war fleet between a single courier ship and its throne, and both sides knew it, and the Reach, scrupulous to the last, had sent no fleet of its own. It had sent one small ship, 81 years old, crewed by one man who looked 25, carrying an empty ewer and a covenant and the truth. The Reach had learned, across 8 decades, that the most frightening thing it could show the conquered was exactly what it was. It did not need a fleet. The Reach was the fleet. Every free world watching was the fleet. Kale, folding down alone through the shafts of colored light, unarmed and unafraid, was a demonstration of power more total than any armada, because it said, "We do not need to threaten you. We have already won, and we won by becoming the thing you were too afraid to let us be." They received him in the hall of the ninefold throne. He walked the marble throat first, the long channel of stone he had last walked as a boy carrying an empty ewer, writing a fallen standard, overhearing 2 gray functionaries murder his species in a language they were sure he could not speak. The marble had not changed. He set his hand against it as he passed, and for a moment the 80 years folded the way spacetime folded, and he was 19 again, cold-handed, invisible, holding the largest secret in the galaxy alone with nowhere to put it. Then the moment passed, and he was 81, and he was not invisible anymore, and the secret was published across 1,000 worlds where anyone could check it. He kept walking. The hall was nearly empty. Where 10,000 delegates had once stood in ratifying silence, there were now perhaps 100 figures, the last of the conquered's core, the Vale Court, and a scattering of the oldest client houses that had not yet departed. The blue crystal dome poured its light down over them, and the light was as glorious as ever, and it fell now upon a court that had shrunk to a remnant beneath a sky too large for it. Kale walked to the foot of the ninefold throne, the place where Ambassador Voss had forgotten to bow, and he stopped, and he looked up. Chancellor Marinth sat upon the steps below the empty throne. He was very old. The silver-gray skin had gone the color of ash, and 2 of his 4 eyes had clouded, and the long hands that Kale remembered forever restless were still in the way of a machine that has finally run down. He had read the writ of severance from this floor 81 years ago, standing tall as 3 men, the sharpest blade in the court. He sat now, and the sitting told Kale everything, because the veil did not sit before those they judged beneath them. "I know you," Marinth said. His voice had lost none of its threading precision. It found every corner of the hall as it always had. "The record does not, but I do. You carried the water. You were behind the delegation on the day. I remember thinking there was one human in the hall who watched us the way we watched them, the clouded eyes fixed on Kale's unaged face. You have not grown old." "I chose a slow road," Kale said. "It kept me young enough to see the end of yours." "Yes," Marinth's ruined hands folded in his lap. "I have had 80 years to compose what I would say to humanity when this day came, and I find I have prepared nothing because I did not until the very end believe this day would come. I believed I had prevented it. I sealed the augury so deep that even I was not to read it again. I told myself I had saved the conquered from a rising it could not survive." He was quiet a moment. I had. That is the part your people will never let me have, and it is nonetheless true. Humanity would have surpassed us. The augury did not lie. Everything the augury foretold has come to pass, and I did everything a chancellor could do to prevent it, and here you stand. I want you to understand that I was not wrong about what you were. I was only wrong to be afraid of it. You were wrong about one thing more, Kale said. You thought that because we would surpass you, we would become you. You buried us so we could not do to the galaxy what you did to us. But we were never going to do to the galaxy what you did to us. That was your fear talking, and your fear was only ever a mirror. You looked at a rising people and you saw yourself rising, and you knew exactly what you would do with that much power because you had already done it, and you could not imagine that anyone would choose differently. He let the words settle in the great crystal quiet. We chose differently, Chancellor, not because we were better made. Because you gave us 80 years and a common enemy and nothing left to lose, and in all that time the one thing we swore, over and over on every world, was that we would not become the thing that cast us out. You didn't just fail to stop us from rising. You taught us, with your own cruelty, exactly what not to be. Marinth bowed his ashen head. Around the hall, the remnant of the court stood in the old ratifying silence, but the silence meant something different now than it had 80 years before. Then it had been the silence of 10,000 who had decided a matter did not concern them. Now it was the silence of 100 who understood that the matter concerned them entirely, and that judgment had come, and that they did not know what shape it would take. Then render it, Marinth said. Whatever your reach has decided, severance in return for severance, it would be just. We marooned 400 million of you to die on a poisoned world, strip us of the lanes, seal us in this system to wither as you were meant to wither. Let the record show that the conquered's mercy was measured out to it in the exact portion it measured to others. The clouded eyes lifted. I would understand it. I would even, I think, be grateful for it. It would mean the galaxy still runs on a law I recognize. And this was the moment the whole of it had been folding toward for 81 years. The moment the augury had foreseen, and the Chancellor had buried a civilization to prevent. The moment a water carrier had walked out of a marble corridor carrying toward across 8 decades of slow voyages. The old empire, kneeling in all but the word, offered humanity the throne of vengeance, and asked only to be destroyed by a law it understood. Kale Sundren reached into his courier's satchel, and the whole remnant of the court tensed, and what he drew out was not a writ and not a weapon. It was an empty ewer, plain, old, unremarkable, the ewer he had carried in this hall as a boy of 19 and kept for 81 years without ever telling a soul why. He set it on the floor at the foot of the ninefold throne. I carried water in this hall, he said, on the day you threw us away. It was the only thing you thought I was good for, a servant who carried water and understood nothing. He looked up at the ash-gray Chancellor. So let me carry it one more time, not the vengeance you're asking for. You want me to seal you in this system to wither, so the galaxy still runs on a law you recognize. But the whole point of 80 years, Chancellor, was to build a galaxy that runs on a law you don't recognize yet. So I won't render severance. I'll render the only thing we ever had to offer, and the thing you never once offered anyone in 10,000 years. He drew out the second thing from his satchel, a slate, and on it 3 plain sentences in the plain words of a logistics officer 80 years dead. The covenant of consent, Kale said. No world joins the human reach except by its own free asking, and any world may leave the same way. The strong exist to shelter the weak. We were cast out on a lie, so we build on the truth forever. He set the slate beside the ewer. The Reach does not want your throne world, Chancellor. Does not want your rings or your crystal or your 10,000 years of glory. It has its own now, built the slow way, and it holds. What the Reach offers the conquered is what it offered the SLLK and the Threnu and every people you passed over as unpromising. Not a leash, the key. Membership by your own free asking as equals, with the whole key given and nothing held back, and the freedom to leave the day you no longer wish to stay. That is the answer humanity carried home, not severance, consent. Ask and be lifted, or don't ask and keep your dome and wither on your own terms with no hand of ours upon you. But we will not be your executioner, because we swore 80 years ago that we would never again be what you were, and we do not intend to break that promise for the pleasure of watching you kneel. And it was then that Chancellor Marinth of the Vale, oldest blade of the oldest court, who had cast humanity out certain it would wither, rose from the steps of the ninefold throne and came down to the floor of the hall where the empty ewer stood, and knelt. He knelt not because he was forced. That was the whole of it. That was the thing the augury could never have measured, and the thing that made the moment more than a conqueror's triumph. There was no fleet above the dome. There was no writ compelling him. There was one unarmed man who looked 25, and an empty ewer, and 3 plain sentences, and a choice held out freely by the people he had tried to bury. Marinth knelt before it because he had, at the very last, understood what the augury had truly foreseen, understood what humanity had become in the dark along a grain of spacetime his people had stopped looking at, understood that the young thing he had feared had grown into something his 10,000 years had never once managed to be, and that the only honest posture left to him before it was the one he had never taught his empire to hold. The remnant of the court knelt behind him. One by one, the last houses of the Ceridine Imperium, the peoples who had stood in ratifying silence while a species was thrown away, went down onto the marble of the hall of the ninefold throne before a water carrier and an empty ewer, and it was not conquest, and it was not vengeance, and it was not the law that Marinth recognized. It was the law that humanity had spent 80 years teaching the galaxy to reach for on its own. The Galactic Empire that had cast humanity out, certain it would wither, knelt at last before the human reach, and knelt freely, which was the only way the reach would ever have accepted it, and the only way that made the kneeling mean anything at all. Kale Sundren looked down at the kneeling court beneath the shafts of colored light, and he did not feel the triumph he had failed to feel folding in. He felt, instead, the thing Ada Morrow had felt in a launch bay 80 years before, planting a tree whose shade she would not sit in. He was the last living human who had stood in this hall as a servant. He had carried the truth out of it and carried it every year since, and now he had carried it home, and it was done, and there was no one left alive who had been there at the beginning to see the end but him. He bent and picked up the ewer, and held it out to the kneeling chancellor. "Get up," Kale said gently. "We don't kneel in the reach, not to anyone." That was always the difference. He pressed the empty ewer into the old Vale's ash-gray hands. "You asked me to render judgment. Here it is. Rise and ask to join us as an equal, or rise and go your own way in peace. But rise. The reach was built by people who were told to stay on their knees and got up anyway." He almost smiled, and for a moment he was 19 again, cold-handed in a marble corridor, holding the largest secret in the galaxy with nowhere to put it and 80 years to carry it. "Someone has to carry the water in the new age too, Chancellor. I've held the job a long time. I think it's finally time I taught someone else." And beneath the great blue dome that a whole moon had been quarried to shape, in the hall where humanity had once been thrown away, the old empire rose from its knees at the bidding of the people it had exiled, and asked, by its own free asking, to be lifted. Kale carried the empty ewer out through the marble throat one last time, into the light, and behind him, a galaxy that had learned at last to check the truth for itself began, freely, to kneel to nothing and rise to everything, exactly as an old woman in a launch bay had planned, exactly as a frightened chancellor had foreseen, and had spent his whole long life failing to prevent.